welcome to Fiction at the Friary in November. This is our final Fiction at the Friary event for 2020, but never fear, we'll be back again with lots of new plans in 2021. I'm shortly going to hand over to my lovely friend and co-host, Danielle McLaughlin. My name is Madeleine Darcy, and I'm here first of all to thank our sponsors, Cork City Council, the School of English at University College Cork, J. Raffle Morris Solicitors, and Hogan Architects. And also thank you to Mike Darcy of the Friary Bar. Pre-COVID, all our events were held live there, and we thank him and his staff, and hopefully we'll be back there at some stage. But post-COVID, it's a virtual pre-recorded event. And I'll hand over to Danielle.
We're delighted to have Ronan Hession as our featured guest author this month. Ronan is an Irish writer based in Dublin. His debut novel, Leonard and Hungry Paul, was published by Blue Moose Books in the UK and by Melville House Books in the US. Leonard and Hungry Paul has been nominated for a number of prizes, including the Irish Novel of the Year and the British Book Award for Best Debut. Ronan has also been longlisted for the Unpost Irish Book Awards for Short Story of the Year. A review of Leonard and Hungry Paul in The Independent referred to its understated beauty, saying, "It will chime with readers for whom the question is not just how to make a novel out of small, simple things, but how to make a life out of them." As Mumblin' Deaf Row, Ronan has released 3 albums of storytelling songs. His 3rd album, Dictionary Crimes, was nominated for the Choice Music Prize for Irish Album of the Year. His 2nd novel, Panenka, will be published in 2021. And we're delighted to welcome to Fiction at the Friary, Ronan Hession. Hello, Ronan.
Hi, Danielle. Hi, Madeleine. Thanks very much for having me. It's really lovely to be here. It's a real pleasure to get a chance to read for you and to sort of chat to you about books and writing. So would you like me to go ahead and do a reading?
Yes, please.
Okay, so thanks very much for anybody watching. I'm going to read the opening chapter from my 2nd novel, a novel called Panenka, which will be out in May 2021. And this is actually the first time I've ever read it for publicly or outside of, the editorial team in Blue Moose. So the book itself, to describe it, it's a very different type of novel, I think, to Leonard and Hungry Paul. I sort of describe it somewhat cryptically, probably, as a redemption story about headaches and a platonic love story. So what I'll do is I'll go straight into chapter 1, which I think gives you a sort of sense of the setting and the tone of the book. So chapter 1, Panenka. His name was Joseph, but for years they had called him Panenka, a name that was his sadness and his story. These past months, the pressure pain in his head had been coming almost every night, building like an Atlantic wave that roiled within his dreams until it broke and crashed through his sleep, shocking him awake. It manifested as a clamp on his face. Working at bone level, it would spread from the crease between his eyebrows, around the orbits of his pounding eyes, and onwards to his jaw, which would stiffen and lock with tension. He called it his iron mask. With the palms of his hands pressed against his cheeks, he would run to the bathroom to compress his face against the cool, hard side of the bath, barely relieving the nerves that had mayday signals pulsing through them. In its own time and on its own terms, the iron mask would eventually lift, allowing the last few ripples of pain to subside and returning Panenka to the unclaimed hours somewhere between late night and early morning. Exhausted, he would haul himself up, his legs all fizzy and useless, and limp back to bed, thinking hungrily about the few hours of sleep that remained. Pulling the duvet up as far as his cheek, which bore no bruises or scars, no evidence of the silent violence, he would catch a bubble of thought passing through his mind. Was this time worse or the same as the last? Was the pain spreading or different? but he had learned to ignore these questions. The Iron Mask was unknowable in any real sense and beyond any bargaining. As Panenka lay there on his side on one of those shipwrecked mornings he had become so used to, his grandson Arthur pushed open the bedroom door and climbed into the bed. His weight was not substantial enough to roll Panenka out of the hollow on his side of the mattress, so the child was able to settle himself back to back into a familiar arrangement based on body heat. He had often cited his grandfather's indulgence of these visits as a defense against his mother's objections to them. Living in a house of adults will sharpen any 7-year-old's advocacy skills to a precocious level. On finding her son's bed ruffled and vacant, Marie-Therese called into Panenka's room without looking. "Arthur, 5 more minutes." "On board," said Arthur to the ceiling once his mother had gone downstairs and out of range. He turned to Panenka and woke him with a nudge to the kidneys. "Pop, can I wear a tracksuit today?" "Morning, my friend," replied Panenka without opening his eyes or moving. "Everyone's wearing tracksuits. It makes no sense to force kids to wear uniforms with ties. It's the wrong type of clothes. Tracksuits are Tuesday and Thursday. But you don't get into trouble if you wear them other days." Arthur leaned up on his elbow, turned Panenka's chin towards him. "Not getting into trouble is not the same as being good," said Panenka. "Do I have to wear a tie then?" "No tie. I agree with you there. I can't think of a single reason for you to wear a tie. In fact, it hardly makes sense for adults to wear them." "Mama," roared Arthur, "I'm not wearing a tie. Pop says I'm allowed." "Stop shouting," called Marie-Therese from downstairs amid the sound of spoons and bowls. "If you want to talk to me, come into the same room that I'm in." "Hit the snooze," said Arthur. Panenka pressed the top of his grandson's head, and they lay back to back for a few more minutes, Arthur falling into the carefree rest of a child, and Panenka sobering himself after the intensity of the past night. He pulled the uniform from the wardrobe in Arthur's room and threw the elastic tie back onto the shelf. Laying it all on the bed, he closed all but the top 2 buttons of the school shirt, leaving those as practice for Arthur to dress himself, each successful effort getting a star on the chore chart. Panenka gave Arthur a piggyback downstairs to the kitchen, where Marie-Therese was wearing an androgynous trouser suit that she had just ironed. The name badge on her lapel had limited space and just said "Trainee Manager, Marie." She had recently taken a promotion at the supermarket where she had worked for several years, going from cashier to a management role that she had been encouraged to apply for. It was a little bit more money, but she lost shift allowances, overtime, and the friendship of the women she had worked with on the registers. And so far, she was struggling to assert herself with the men in the stockroom. There was something subtly undermining in their frigid cooperation, and she could sense their hostility, like a draft on her shoulders, whenever she swept through to look in on them. But she contained her anxiety and instead projected managerial competence through her perfectionism. She had been taught that retail is detail and was meticulous in her standards, despite knowing that this was a sure way to get called a bitch behind her back. As she sometimes reminded herself, this was all part of getting ahead and taking her life back, even if the small patch of alopecia behind her left ear had begun to worry her. It was easy to hide now, but if it became any bigger, it would surely expose her lack of confidence, or worse, earn her a nickname. "Here you go, Arthur. Make sure you don't get it on your uniform," she said, handing him a bowl of porridge with honey in it. "We'll have to go to school early today. I'm due in for the delivery shift." "Don't worry about that," said Panenka. "I've a later start today, so I can drop him off at the gates before I go. He's still waking up, I think." Arthur was sitting on a beanbag, staring at cartoons, his bowl balanced on his soft belly as he slouched. His hand rested on the remote, having nudged up the volume to drown out the adults' chatter behind him. "How are you this morning?" she asked, kissing her father on the top of the head. "I heard you up and about last night. Everything okay?" "It's those migraines. I'll get it seen to. I feel normal now, like it never happened. Have you had breakfast?" "I have a banana in the bag. I better run. I need to get in before the delivery is done. I have to check everything off." "Can't you get someone else to do it? One of the lads?" "I could, but if there's a mistake, it comes out of my pocket. See you later." Marie-Therese stooped down to kiss Arthur, who was engrossed in the screen. "Be good for Pop now, won't you, buddy?" she said. As she pulled away, he caught the back of her neck and hooked her in for a kiss of his own. Arthur preferred dry kisses. Wet ones got wiped off with his sleeve. Panenka sat over his coffee and porridge, half watching the cartoons himself. His cheeks and forehead were clear, no lingering sensations. He had described it as a face migraine to his doctor, who had known him for years, ever since his footballing days had ended. He and the doctor were about the same age, and Panenka was not the first man he had examined who had downplayed his health worries. As their families had grown up, they had often chatted informally during routine checkups, enjoying the type of jokes that men share in private. The doctor was concerned about the headaches, but would say little about the condition, except that migraines shouldn't feel like iron masks, and that Panenka would need a scan. He could wait 9 months, or else go private if he could afford it. Panenka had said that there was no big rush and that he didn't mind waiting, embarrassed about declaring his financial situation to an old friend. I'll tell you what, the doctor said. There's a Dr. Wolf who's doing a series of short residencies at the hospital. He's a consultant neurosurgeon from Portugal who's an expert in middle-aged men with headaches who follow underachieving football teams. So maybe I can see about getting you a session with them. It's a teaching residency, which means there'll be a registrar there, a trainee surgeon who's learning from him. That be your problem? Is it private or public? Neither. It's sort of off books. It's a teaching consultation, so there's no cost, provided you're comfortable with being part of the training process. To be honest, I'm only telling you about this because we've known each other a long time. I think it's worth getting this checked out soon. I don't want to worry you, but I think you need to be examined by someone experienced. It might be nothing, but a nothing from Dr. Wolf is worth more than a nothing from me. Deal? He asked. Why not? He had been booked for a preliminary scan the following week, getting an afternoon off work to go on his own. It was all over in time for him to be home for dinner with Marie-Therese and Arthur at the usual hour. He had said nothing to them about the scan or the panic attack that he had had when he was in the MRI scanner, nor about the long chat with the young radiographer about changing his mind, or the submissive resignation when he was delivered into the machine for a second time, feeling utterly powerless and alone. He had expected that they would print off the scan pictures like at a passport booth and tell him the news one way or the other. But the pictures had to be referred to Dr. Wolf and Dr. Nunez, whoever he was, or, as it turned out, whoever she was. It had taken 4 weeks for Dr. Wolf's office to call Panenka for that morning's appointment. Panenka shaped the last few lumps of porridge into a spoonful and finished it. Time's up, Arthur. Brush your teeth before it's too late. We're going in 300 seconds. That's 5 minutes, said Arthur without shifting. He was used to his grandfather's sly way of pushing arithmetic on him. They walked through the part of town Panenka had lived in for many years, an area known as the Crucible, where a mix of strays, seasonal workers, and outsider communities lived, people dependent on the local authorities mostly. Over the years, much of the area had been scheduled for demolition, or urban regeneration as it was called, but there was always a new population of unwanted people that needed to be housed somewhere, anywhere, and the Crucible served a useful purpose as far as the town was concerned. It was a sort of spare room where all the problems were dumped, with a view to sorting them out later, or forgetting about them altogether. It was where the pavements crumbled, where blown street lamps went the longest without being fixed, where people used sheets as curtains, where grown men lived 4 to a room in bunk beds. For all its flaws, it was cheap and within walking distance of most places. Panenka had always liked the invisibility of living in the Crucible, it being full of people from elsewhere who were too busy with their own precarious lives to notice him. They walked up to the school with Panenka shouldering Arthur's bag, which was heavier than he had expected. In it was a Tupperware box, packed with the school bismuth, a futuristic silver-grey block from the science table that Arthur had been entrusted with over the weekend as a reward for coming second in a quiz. It had never left his bag. Pop, what's plastic surgery? Asked Arthur, kicking a flattened Coke can into the road while they waited at the pedestrian crossing. It's when people get an operation on their skin to make them look younger. Flattens out their wrinkles. Oh. Why, what did you think it was? I don't know. I thought it was like pretend surgery. Come on, screamed Man. Mama said that some people are addicted to plastic surgery. Let's not talk crossing the road, my friend. Wait until we get to the other side. Remember, both ways. I'm doing it. Don't be a lighthouse, moving your head from side to side. Pay attention. At the other curve, they joined the shoal of children holding hands with grown-ups, all going in the same direction. Do footballers get plastic surgery? Not when I played. These days they look like pop stars, so maybe that's changed. I was more worried about surgery on my knees and my ankles. Did you ever have an operation? A few times, unfortunately. What was the worst one? Once I broke my leg and then had to break it again because I didn't set properly. That's disgusting. Arthur grabbed his bag when they reached the school gates and bolted to join a group of boys who were huddled and talking excitedly like Wall Street traders. He had quietly explained to Panenka a few weeks before that goodbye kisses were acceptable at home, but not in public. Even hugs and high fives were being suspended pending a full review. Arthur was comparing heights with a boy that Panenka had seen before at one of the birthday parties. Arthur looked cleaner and newer standing next to him, with hair that was styled and not just short. His shoes didn't have broken laces. His jumper was fitted without looking too small. The other boy looked a little unfinished beside him, not that either of them noticed or cared. It all came from Marie-Therese and her unappreciated attention to the little things. She kept it all in her head, all on top of her new job and 1,001 other things a 28-year-old mother was supposed to fit into her life. The school bell rang and the children ran screaming into their lines as the parents broke off their small talk and dispersed back to their cars. Mostly mothers, a few dads, and, least hassled of all, the grandparents helping out. At 50, Panenka was a young grandfather and was good at it, that is to say, interested in it. There was a playful inversion involved in the grandfather-grandson relationship. It was child-led. Arthur chose the agenda and set the pace for their conversations, which always led back to him answering his own questions in his own way. He had such an innocent certainty, as though we were not so much figuring things out as recalling lost knowledge from a previous existence. Working methodically, he used yes-no questions to deconstruct the world's inconsistencies and injustices. In all this, Panenka was the sidekick, the who's there and the knock-knock joke, as well as the clown, the tickler, the absurdist, the dumb bunny that Arthur explained things to. Nobody ever goes to counselling about their difficult grandparents. It is love without the stakes. If only Panenka's other relationships had been like that. Perhaps they could have been. But it was too late for that thought. It was needed years ago when he was failing as a father, a husband, a friend, as a human. Too much of his life had involved making mistakes and bad choices that carved deep grooves into the lives of those around him. Who was he to be wise now? He had always guessed that his failings would have to be accounted for eventually, and that there would be a reckoning. So that was how he saw things, and that was how he saw the abjection of the night on the bathroom floor. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Ronan. That was fabulous.
Thank you.
Listening to that, I'm very struck by how, even though Panenka is dealing with this crushing pain that he's experiencing, he still has time to have this very beautiful, very touching relationship with the people he's sharing his life with, his daughter and his grandson. And that got me thinking, are we going to be meeting more of the gentleness and the embracing of kindness in Panenka that we met in Leonard and Hungry Paul? Is that something else that we'll be seeing here?
I think it's probably, it's a lot more complicated, I think, in Panenka. I think Panenka is essentially a man who is living with failure and his own failings, and essentially has lived his adult life in a sort of state of emotional exile, and facing into some difficult times, really is facing some very serious questions about what he should do in the time ahead. And it's really about, how do people fix themselves? How do lives that are maybe unfixable carry on? So I think it's probably in a different, I would say, emotional register to Leonard and Hungry Paul. The themes, while I think I'm always interested in human nature and relationships, there's an awful lot more, I think, probably sadness and depth in this book. I found it quite a moving book to write, actually, and much more so than I'd expected. Kind of led me to all sorts of places. So I think it'll probably feel, whereas Leonard and Hungry Paul is probably quite a warm book, this is probably something that is a little more troubled. But I think my fundamental belief in human nature is still there at the center of it, having said that.
And the character of Panenka, where did he come from for you? How did he present when he first arrived in your head?
I think I've always sort of had in my mind for quite a few years the idea of somebody who has given up on themselves, somebody who doesn't like or accept themselves. And I've always been, there are times when I've picked up books thinking that they were about that subject, only to find out that they weren't. And it's something that has been on my mind a lot for a very long time. And when I was sort of finished Leonard and Hungry Paul, or certainly when I was, maybe even before I submitted it, I already knew I wanted to write about somebody in that place. And in particular, I wanted to write about a wider cast of people. So I think in Panenka's life, there's a wider group of people that you meet as you go through the book. And it's a question of something that looks like it's got, that it's just going to continue. When life continues, there's a lot to be said for momentum in life. And some people have a negative momentum, and it just will continue unchecked. And if people aren't able to pull themselves out of that. So what happens? How do you reset your life? How do other people in your life play a part in that? And what are the possibilities when you can't be fixed? What are the other possibilities? And that, which makes it sound quite bleak, but I think there are lots of, I think anyway, quite beautiful moments in the book, and that I found quite moving to write, and that still affect me now. So I hope that when people go through the book, that those sort of emotional charges are preserved in it for them.
Oh, having heard that first chapter, I'm sure that they will be. And in fact, I remember it as a hallmark of your writing from Leonard and Hungry Paul as well. As is humor. You write such wonderful humor. Is there humor in Panenka also?
I think there is. I think that it isn't as much in the narrative voice. I think Leonard and Hungry Paul is quite a prominent narrator who does push the humor along. I think Panenka is probably a more serious book, but there are those moments with Arthur or just the exchanges. I think there's a lot of domesticity in the book, actually, and I think naturally people who know each other very well in a sort of family setting, it's quite spontaneous, their humor. So it isn't as joke based, it's more banter based perhaps. And also Panenka has a wider group of friends, and I think the way they are in the world, and the way, I think there's a lot about, probably another theme here is male friendship is still another theme here, but it's tackled in a more sort of ensemble way, I think, in Panenka, as opposed to the sort of buddy approach in Leonard and Hungry Paul. So they're quite different books. I think in a way Panenka is probably more like my music than it is like Leonard and Hungry Paul. I think the sort of feel of it, I think.
I've been thinking here about Leonard and Hungry Paul, and there certainly seems to be a development in your writing now, but I am more than confident there'll still be wit as well as emotional depth. I laughed out loud at the first page of Leonard and Hungry Paul, and I found that, there were so many lovely examples of a humor and sentences that were extraordinarily funny. And then, these little domestic controversies mentioned in passing, like playing the word Z-A in Scrabble. And I don't want to mention any spoilers, but another thing that I loved about it during reading it during lockdown was that these very nice people were living their best lives in a very ordinary way, but they were also going out, working, a wedding was being prepared, all the kinds of things that maybe we're not able to do so much at the moment. But what I wanted to know was how you came about the characters of Leonard and Hungry Paul. Where did they come from originally, Ronan?
I think the book began really with Leonard. You know, I hadn't intended to write a book. I really just had this. It had been about 5 years since my last album, and I had sort of more or less given up on creativity. I sort of thought I was I sort of satisfied, but also a little bit maybe burnt out as well. But I kept getting flashes of the character of Leonard. And eventually I said I would try and write something about him. And I had a new diary. It was the beginning of 2017. And I said I'd write a little bit about him to get to know him. And after about the second day, I just said, okay, sod it, I'm just going to try and write a novel. And I knew, I'd heard somebody say if you got to 10,000 words, you'd have a sense of how it's going. So I got to that stage quite quickly. And then I really got a sense, see, Leonard really came from, I had sort of come to notice in life, there were an awful lot of quiet people who were easy to overlook. You know, in a social setting, walking down the street, they're not people you would necessarily notice. But over my life, I'd encountered a lot of quiet people. When I got to know them, I found them quite impressive. I found them having quite a bright perspective on life and a great sensitivity. And I began to wonder of what's missing in life or the world. Perhaps they have the thing that's missing. Because we all know what loud people think. We all know what opinionated people think because they tell us. But we don't really hear from quieter people. And then with Hungry Paul, I suppose I began to sort of think about it's not just who we are as people that defines us. There are other people bring things out of us. So I felt there needed to be a sort of foil for Leonard, perhaps a more extreme version of Leonard in some ways, who was even more committed to that quiet life. And that just allowed them to draw each other out. And I felt they would, at two people, I felt it was a movement, you know.
A quick question. You never tell us why Hungry Paul is called Hungry Paul either. And I actually love the fact that I don't know. I presume that was deliberate as well. Or did you think about specifying why?
Well, actually, only the narrator called him Hungry Paul. Other than that, in the book, he's not named by anybody. No, he's never addressed by name or referred to by name. So only the narrator calls him that. And I liked the idea where the name Hungry Paul came from. My wife has a bus driver uncle who has two friends, Tall Paul and Hungry Paul. And I always said, if I was ever doing a book, I'd use the name Hungry Paul. And I like that it's kind of a non-descriptor. You know, you would never say, oh, you should meet my husband. What's he like? Oh, he's very hungry. So it's kind of, it doesn't really tell you who he is. And it's just, I suppose, if anything, it's maybe just a little hint that he is a different type of character and actually has a different role in the book than the other characters. I think the other characters go through a change. You sort of see a steady state. They go through a change. They have a way of dealing with the world. Basically, they have a way of dealing with the world that stops it overwhelming them. They all have that. There's a change in the steady state and they adjust to their old coping mechanisms don't work and they have to develop new ones. Hungry Paul's kind of the exception to that because he doesn't change. What changes really is our perception of him. You know, if you were to think in Ireland, if you were to say to people, there's this guy, he's in his 30s and he lives at home with his parents, they'd be like, that's all I need to know. That's all I need to know. I know exactly who you're talking about. And he would completely have the rest of his backstory and his future known to them. So I said that's a good starting point because if I wanted to work against people's expectations, I'll work with the handicap of them already thinking that about him and then try and flip that. And that, I think with Hungry Paul, I think it's the reader that changes, whereas the others, I think the other characters change. I think that's what I was trying to do now.
I loved it. I love Hungry Paul, and I can't ruin it all for people by the spoiler, but he changes as well. He gets a very interesting job. Can I ask you a little bit about the structure of Leonard and Hungry Paul? Because I was really impressed that each chapter was very tight. They were quite short, but they moved you on beautifully from one character to the other and then to the events that followed. And I wonder, in a practical sense, did the material just lend itself to that form, or did you do a lot of redrafting and planning and cogitating and manipulating your material?
I didn't really plan it, because what I did is what informed the sort of structure, there were a couple of things. I remember when I was sort of starting it, and I'd been watching a DVD, and I was off sick for a couple of days, and I watched half of it one day and half the other day, and I went into the scene selection function, and I remember thinking, oh, they're all different scenes. I just thought it was film and it kind of changed, but they're actually, each one's an individual scene. So I decided to work with that sort of idea of, you know, essentially they're each vignettes. And to try and change, to get a different perspective on the characters, you have them in different combinations. And you know, in terms of practical advice, that helped me was, there's, in a Paris Review interview, there was P.G. Woodhouse. His advice to writers was, he said, imagine you had a great casting director who got you the world's top actors to be in your play. Top actors won't want to be off stage that long. So make sure your characters are not off stage too long. And so I tried to make sure that there wasn't huge intervals between the characters, but they were appearing in different settings. So even though, so it wasn't just a Hungry Paul chapter, then a Grace chapter, then a Helen chapter, then a Hungry Paul chapter, and that they were appearing in different formation. And so you had a sort of sense that you were seeing them through a slightly different lens each time, and you could kind of layer that. The other thing is, I didn't want it to be, I knew I didn't want to go to the sort of classic arc shape. And I didn't want it to be built around a big, there are a couple of sort of red herrings there. You know, the wedding is not as dramatic as you know, you might think. The job is actually kind of a red herring as well. There are a few other red herrings like that. And really, I just kind of had a sort of structurally thinking of a more flowering type story, that it should just feel richer at the end. A bit like a way a poem works, I think, you know, the way it just takes you in one place and leaves you somewhere else. It doesn't have to necessarily move you in a linear way.
I wonder, are we going to have another short reading?
I can do a short reading of Leonard and Hungry Paul if you like. Leonard was raised by his mother alone with cheerfully concealed difficulty, his father having died tragically during childbirth. Though she was not by nature the soldiering type, she taught him to look at life as a daisy chain of small events, each of which could be made manageable in its own way. She was a person for whom kindness was a very ordinary thing, who believed that the only acceptable excuse for not having a bird feeder in the back garden was that you had one in the front garden. As sometimes happens with boys who prefer games to sports, Leonard had few friends but lots of ideas. His mother understood with intuitive good sense that children like Leonard just need someone to listen to them. They would set off to the shops discussing conger eels and have a deep conversation about Saturn's moons on the way back. They would talk about tidal waves at bath time and say goodnight with a quick chat about the man with the longest fingernails in the Guinness Book of World Records. But Leonard grew up at a time when quiet, imaginative children did not yet enjoy the presumption of innocence. His mother often found herself having to take his side against ornery teachers who complained that they found it impossible to get through to him. With patient maternal endurance, she would sit by herself at parent-teacher meetings, explaining that, like his late father, he just lacked a eureka face. Even into his 30s, Leonard's mother still liked to fuss over him, buying his favourite ham for lunch, the one with fewer veins running through it, leaving tea by the bedside for when he woke up, and ironing well-meaning creases into his jeans, which Leonard would quietly iron out later. He repaid her thoughtfulness by keeping her company through her later years and generally including her in the uncrowded bandwidth of his life. Leonard was not exactly sure, but there must have come a point when their relationship grew from a purely filial one into one of partnership. Though an adult son living with his widowed mother is a situation about which society has yet to adopt a formal position, it is clearly seen in second-best terms. Insofar as anyone noticed, they might have assumed that she was overbearing or that he lacked initiative and possibly a sex drive. In reality, neither sought to limit or interfere with the other, both being independent people who liked their own space and who, quite simply, got along. Leonard did recall some awkwardness around a suggestion that they go on holidays together, though he was not entirely certain which of them had first proposed it. Mother-daughter holidays are normal, of course, and father-son trips are famously storied as a way to come of age. Mother-son holidays, though, have the connotation that one of them must be a burden on the other. But truth be told, they were well suited as travelling companions. She was a keen walker and a good gallery feat, being able to wander around any reasonable exhibition in its entirety without being distracted by the gift shop honeypot that drew in tired women half her age. They both liked churches, and even though Leonard was not religious himself, much of the world's art is. He would enjoy visiting famous paintings and sculptures in European cathedrals, while his mother would busy herself lighting a candle in a side chapel for her fragile, long-departed husband. She had never really asked Leonard about girls, knowing the delicacy of the subject for him, and also because of her own doubts about whether his apparently celibate life was due to a lack of interest or opportunity. For Leonard, the fact that he still lived at home with his mother led to a certain self-restraint on practical grounds. He had wondered what would have happened had he brought a girl home only for them to wake up to 2 cups of tea at the bedside the next morning. His mother passed away unexpectedly one midweek night in her sleep, tucked into a duvet with all her clothes laid out for the next day, her neatness being a sign of her respect for the small things in her life. The doctor noted the cause of death as a heart attack, but emphasized that there were no signs of suffering or drama. He said that her heart must have simply run out of beats. So I leave it there.
I absolutely love that. You work full-time, and you're also in lockdown like the rest of us. How do you manage to be so prolific, and what are your next plans?
I suppose I've always, I'm a civil servant by day, and even before my sort of working career started, I was involved in music. So I've always sort of had a secret sort of superhero existence where I had something parallel, something creative. And so I've always been able to maintain that. I've been that way actually for nearly 30 years, to be honest with you. So I have a relationship, I think, with my creativity that I don't never try and push it. And I think the way I sort of recognize what I think is a genuinely creative idea is that it also comes with an allocation of energy. It's not just me trying to drum up something and then try and sketch it out. It feels like it's pressing on me, it's coming to me, and I feel energized when I'm writing. So I think that helps me distinguish between when I just have a sort of fanciful thought and when I have something that actually has potential. And also it's quite insistent. So say, for example, you asked me about Leonard. You know, Leonard as a character or the idea for Panenka, I just keep coming to me all the time, just keep getting flashes of that. So there's just something that's just coming together inside me. So during lockdown, I've just really continued, you know, I would normally write at night about 10 o'clock. I'd start writing and write for about 2 hours, 2.5 hours. And I would write that way for a few months and then take a month off and go back. So I've just continued, you know, I spent most of lockdown working on editing Panenka. And I also wrote a short story, which I don't normally do, but I sort of cheated. It was kind of like a 2,700 word novel. I didn't really use a short story structure, so I sort of bent the rules a bit. So I try not to, you know, I don't try and be prolific or anything like that. And after this, my next plan is I'm doing a third book for Blue Moose, hopefully many more, but another book called Ghost Mountain, which again, I'm happy that the ideas for that, the images that are kind of flashing from me all the time. So, but I'll have to think about, you know, I think I need to pace myself a bit more. I think I have to be careful I don't burn out. I'm quite new to writing. I only started writing a couple of years ago, so I need to make sure my enthusiasm doesn't lead to me, you know, overheating.
Do you plan to write a book about a musician or featuring musicians at any point?
That hasn't come to me as an idea. It's interesting. The things I tend to write about, the details I tend to write about, tend not to be from within my own personal life. They were things I may have just had glimpses of. I've never really been tempted to, you know, say write something autobiographical. Like, I grew up in a family of 8 children. You know, my father died when I was 7, so my mother was a widow with 8 kids. It was a crazy house. It was nothing like Leonard and Hungry Paul's house. You know, it was completely. In fact, Leonard and Hungry Paul's house is more like the way my friends' houses seemed to me. They seemed sort of calm and sane places, and I was kind of like Leonard, sort of an adjunct member of their families. So I've never really been drawn to write too directly about my experience. So as a musician, or I don't think we'd be seeing a civil servant or a you know, something that I would just hammer away at my own life. I do think I love swimming around in my imagination. That's really what excites me about writing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ronan. I think we've learned a lot from you today, and I did feel I wished that you were going to do a Leonard and Hungry Paul sequel, but now I'm just fascinated to read Fanenka, and I wish you the very, very best of luck with that too. Thanks so much for speaking to us today.
Thank you. My pleasure, absolutely.
To remind our listeners, Leonard and Hungry Paul is published by Blue Moose Books, and we're very much looking forward to Panenka, which will be out, I think, in May 2021.
That's right.
Thanks again, Ronan, for a fascinating discussion today and for those great readings. We're delighted that you are our featured author for this month. To remind anyone listening that we'll also have a free online book raffle happening today. So if you go to our Twitter account at Fiction Friary or to our Facebook page, Fiction at the Friary, we'll have details on how to enter that free book raffle. I think that's all from us for today. Our thanks again to Ronan.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really honoured that you invited me. It's a real pleasure to read for you, and I really enjoyed our chat. So thanks so much for having me.